Welcome. Part 3. This is the part where I tell you about meeting my husband for the first time and also losing my mother. That is the continuance from yesterday. So I'm going to start with meeting my husband. That was July 4th, 2001. I pulled into a friend's house in Meigs County, and I almost ran directly into his purple Harley Davidson. I went inside to find the most handsome guy that was squatted down in the middle of the living room. He was wearing a black Harley Davidson leather jacket, and he had on dark sunglasses. He had coal black wavy hair, and oh my God, I was taken. He stopped me in my tracks, like, he was the cutest thing I'd ever seen. Let's see. This guy's name is Michael, and he is now my husband. That was the first time I ever laid my eyes on him. He called me a few days later after we had initially met there, and my mom, this is how controlling she was of me. So Michael called me the first time. It was in the evening. Let me back up a little bit. Michael and I met at a friend's house, but I dated a friend of Mike's for just a hot second. And that's how Michael found out about me. So, he called me and we talked on the phone, and this is 20 years ago. So cell phones were definitely a thing, but home phones were definitely also very popular. We were talking on a landline, and I remember my mom was on the other phone, the other landline, because if you are younger, then you may not know this, and that is if you had a landline, you could have multiple phones connected to the same number, and it was like kind of like three-way calling. Like, you could all pick up the phone and everybody could talk, or you could shut up and just listen. And that's what she did. She listened in on the other end of that call. And him and I talked for a few minutes, and I take this back. I met Michael after we had this conversation. We had the conversation first. Michael seen my pictures from a friend of his, which I was talking to, and he found my number through mutual people, and he called me. That is the phone call that I'm talking about. He called me. It was, I'm gonna say a week or so before July 4th. So the very end of June. This is when this phone call had taken place. He had called me. My mom had listened into the whole phone call. He asked me if I was serious about his friend, which at that time I don't even think we were talking. And we hung up, and my mom looked at me and said, "That's who you'll marry." And I was like, okay. Like, I didn't have a clue who he was. Like, I didn't have a clue what he looked like. I knew that I thoroughly enjoyed the sound of his voice. And then July 4th is the day that I actually came face to face with him. So I had already had a connection with him through voice. Like, I loved the sound of his voice, and then I met him, and he still is gorgeous. So after that first initial meeting, him and I seeing each other, he did call me the next day. And after that phone call, him and we have been together ever since. Like, the rest is history. Like, we are still together. We are very much in love, very happy. God gave him to me, and I am very certain of that. Okay, so fast forward. From July 4th, 2001, when I met Michael, he did get to meet my mother. Now we fast forward to October 12th, 2001. That's the day that my mother passed away. I was at work at a department store in Athens. I was working in Athens, Ohio, and I was working at a store named Goodies. It was a department store. This was on October 11th. I went to work on October 11th. My mom didn't actually pass away till the 12th, but I went to work on October 11th. I got a call from a family member telling me that it was my cousin. She was telling me that they had just drove past my house and they had seen the ambulance taking my mom out on a stretcher. My heart sunk to my stomach. I was, at work. So, let's see. I remember calling Holzer Hospital, which is where they would have taken her. The squad would have taken her. And I was at the department store in Athens. I remember calling Holzer to the emergency room, and they told me on the line that they were dealing with a cardiac arrest patient, and she hung up. And that happened to be my mother. Needless to say, I told my boss that I had to go right then. I left work, and I drove from Athens, Ohio to Gallipolis, Ohio in 40 minutes. Again, God was with me. When I pulled into the hospital, my dad and my brother were standing there. And they told me that she was still alive, but only because of life support. And they had done some testing, and they were waiting to see if there was any active brainwaves, if she had any brain activity. I went into her room, and she was huge. Like, she was a bigger lady anyway. She was not like super skinny, but she was really, really swollen, and she had tubes in every hole she had. There was IVs everywhere, and when she took a breath, it was a full expansion of your chest because the machine was breathing, and they were very repetition, like it wasn't like a normal person breathing. So the entire night. Now, mind you, I had been with Michael for, 3 months. And his mom, which I didn't really know at the time, but she lived in northern Ohio, and she drove down and sat with us in the hospital. And there was like me and my dad and my brother and my aunt. We all just sat there all night, taking turns going in to visit her. Anyway, one time while I was in there, I was holding her hand because the doctor said the last thing that goes before you actually pass away is your hearing. And I was holding her hand and I was talking to her, and all of a sudden, between the breaths from the machine, she exhaled just slightly. It was like, and I was like, she's breathing. But in reality, that, I believe, was her very last breath that she ever took. After that, she coded several times, and they kept bringing her back with machines. Okay, so all night we had spent sitting up, and Michael lived in Wellston, and he worked midnights. And it was early on October 12th. This is October 12th. And it's early in the morning, and I was like, I gotta get some sleep. So I drove to Wellston, and I got in bed with him just because I needed to feel safe and I needed to take a nap. And just shortly after that, I got a phone call from, I want to say it was my brother, maybe my dad, I can't remember. And they said that the testing had came back and that she had no active brainwaves. So she was completely brain dead. And that if I wanted to see her alive again, that I should come right then, because they were choosing to unplug her. And I opted out of that. I had seen enough. And at 2:42 p.m. on October 12th, they unplugged her. And this is how I know that she was gone before they unplugged her. 2:42 she was unplugged, and at 2:45 she was gone. So 2:45 p.m. on October 12th, my mom was gone. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, let's see. I got in the car, I came back to Cheshire from Wellston, and there was a one red light in Cheshire. And I met my dad at that red light. And we both got out of the car, and he dropped to his knees and he was crying, and this was the first time in my 19 years that I'd ever seen him cry. The next few weeks, months were kind of a blur. Like I couldn't sleep. I was 19 and I was terrified of the dark. I couldn't sleep during the day because it was too light out. The struggle was very real. I had Michael, and he was the only thing that kept me wanting to live. I don't know how to explain the level of depression that I was in at that point. I didn't care. I was 19. I didn't care if I lived or died. I actually probably hoped to die because my mom and I didn't have the greatest relationship. And now she was gone. So that was it. Like there was no changing ever again. It was official. If I was able to fall asleep, I had nightmares of her, my mother, coming back. And it was a repeated nightmare. And she would knock on the door and I would answer it. And she was... It was like she was young. It wasn't the old version of her. And I never knew her, obviously, when she was young, but that was the version of in my dream, was the young version. And she would always say, "You thought I was gone, didn't you? I'm not." And I would wake in complete fear and this overwhelming anxiety that she wasn't really gone. I went through a spell of major panic attacks during this time. They mimicked a grand mal seizure. I eventually got through that with some therapy and medication, and mostly Michael telling me that I had to straighten up. Like I had a life to live and I needed to get back on track. And at the time I probably thought he was being mean to me, but now I feel like if he wasn't that way with me, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know how long I would have made it, if I would have made it. I got my job interview for GDC, which is where I worked for 13 years. Later October. Now my mom died October 12th, so this was later that same month, maybe early in November. I did get hired, and they had placed a hiring freeze, so I didn't actually start, and I think it was the following July before I actually started the position. Through all of the tribulations, Michael and I made it. And it was absolutely not easy. He had a hard time understanding me and where I was coming from, but he never left me. He might have yelled at me, but he never left me. Valentine's Day 2002. Just 7 months after we had started dating. He proposed to me with his grandmother's original wedding set. And I knew at that time that God truly had sent him to me at the most perfect time in my life to accept him. But God always does things in perfect time. Okay, so now we are We are engaged. I am mentally becoming stronger as the days go on. But we're going to fast forward to September of 2002. September 2002. I started my period a week early. Now, I was on birth control. I'd been on birth control our whole relationship. And we had talked about kids, but I didn't necessarily, nor did he, think that that was the right time to have kids. Again, God does everything in perfect timing. So I was on birth control. I started my period a week early, solid 7 days early. And I was working midnights at GDC. I'm talking heavy, like I went through like a pad an hour. Like it was like a hemorrhaging type of bleeding. So I left work, I went to 2 different doctors, emergency rooms, and both of them told me that I was not pregnant. I had not had a miscarriage. It was just abnormal bleeding from my cervix. I didn't know to question. Like, it's abnormal, so that's not normal. So I just took the answer and left. The next day, the bleeding had completely stopped. So I bled like crazy for one whole day, and then the next day it was gone. So I continued to take my pills because I was told I was not pregnant. And after I finished that week, my period never came. And I waited 19 days, and I was, okay, my out, and still to this day, if I'm very nervous, I have nervous energy, I have crazy anxiety, like I want to clean, I want to rearrange furniture, that calms me. So back in this time of my life, I did that daily because my anxiety was through the roof, and I was not medicated. I am medicated now, which is probably why I'm much better. Let's see. So I was 19 days late, and I was cleaning my house, and I was in the bathroom, and I found a pregnancy test because I had had a scare or 2 prior with Mike. So there was some in the bathroom, or one, and I took it. And when I tell you that the thought of it coming back positive was like not in my head, because I was told that I was not pregnant. And it was so positive, so quick, I was like, wow. And Mike's cousin, Tessa, was somebody that got me through a lot of hard times in my life. She was a very, very good friend, still is family to me, will always be, but her and I at one time were extremely close. So I drove to her house with this positive pregnancy test in hand. And it was like 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And she was asleep on the couch, and I woke her up, and I was like, look. And she like jumped up, and she was like, oh my God, you're pregnant. I was like, shh, don't tell. Panic had set in. So we drove to Walmart. I bought every brand of pregnancy test that they offered, and there was 5 different brands. I took 6 tests that night. Every time I had to pee, I peed on a test. Every single time the test came back positive, and even more positive as the night went on. So again, I don't sleep all night long. And Michael worked midnights. He worked at the coal mine. And he came in the door at like 5:30 in the morning, and I was sitting up and I said, "Hey." And he was like, "What are you doing up?" And I was like, "Do you love me?" And he was like, "I mean, if I didn't, I wouldn't be here." And he said, "Why?" And I was like, "Yes." And he said, "You're pregnant." And I said, "How did you know?" Like, I was like shocked. I was like, "How did you know that?" And he said, "Last night, it was around 9 o'clock." And I was like, the guys that I was working with, I said, "Hey, I think Des is pregnant." And we both kind of chuckled. And that moment was the start of the rest of my life. And that is all for part 3. But part 4 will be about my time at GDC, the ups and downs of marriage life, having a child. Stay tuned.